Well, a very good afternoon to you all. Welcome to International Coach Week. It's Natalie Ashdown back here with you again. And it's wonderful to see you all coming on the line. Quite a lot of people coming on the line. A really important conversation we're going to have this afternoon. Feel free, as you're just settling in, to pop a message into the chat box. Let us know where you are dialing in from. We have had people dial in from all around the world today and the rest of the week throughout International Coach Week. It's been absolutely amazing. Everywhere from Bali, Morocco, UK, USA, Malaysia, down the road at Cape Shank, Canberra, Brisbane, Perth, you name it. So it really has felt like an International Coach Week this week. So, and there we go. Isabel's dialing in from Bangkok. Guy, welcome from Canberra. Mike's down the road in Melbourne. So yeah, wonderful to see you all. If you'd like to interact with us today, I will be picking up your comments. Just feel free to send those comments to the panelists and attendees, and I can pick up the comments, and I'll be sharing them with Professor Deborah Blackman as we go along as well. So before I begin, my name's Natalie Ashdown from Open Door Coaching, and a big shout out to our partners in International Coach Week for this year, which is Synergy Global, and a shout out to CEO Heather Jane Gray, who's also on the line with us. And I look forward to capturing all your comments and ideas as well, Heather Jane. Welcome Ben from Sydney. There we go. We're all good. Great. So Sweden has joined us from India as well, which is amazing. Sim from Malaysia, welcome to you. Wonderful. So before I begin, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands on which we meet today and acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging, and anyone who might be on the line from an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander descent. And I also extend our acknowledgement of the traditional lands for any other Indigenous people who might be joining us on the line from the countries and the lands that you're actually joining us on. So today it's an absolute treat. We've invited back Professor Deborah Blackman, who is the head of School of Business and the Public Research Group there at the University of Canberra. You will know, or some of you may not know, that Deborah is actually my supervisor for my professional doctorate. And I must say, anytime Deborah opens her mouth, I get out the notepad, I start scribbling down everything, and we always record my supervision sessions because there's so much value, so much that she offers. And today we're all going to be enjoying learning from her as she shares with us around performance conversations, why we need different and not more. So welcome, Deborah. Thank you so much for joining us. I know you've had a massive day. So it's wonderful that you've taken this time out to be with us here this afternoon, and I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Natalie, you'll be proud of me. I have found the chat now.
Oh, you have. Excellent.
That's one panic down. I have got everything on the wrong screen, so I apologise if I keep looking in the wrong direction, but that's owing to operator error as to what's on what screen, so I apologise for that in advance. I'm hoping you won't have to take too many notes this time, Natalie, because you have heard this before. So thank you to anybody who has come back, but I'm hoping it's all new people. And what I want to really talk about today is, as Natalie says, it's performance conversations, why we need different, not more. And this came out of some work we did a few years ago with the APSC, looking at trying to come up with a way to diagnose whether your performance management system was likely to be effective or not. And as a result of all of that, it became very clear that there was some issues around not whether there were performance conversations, but much more importantly, what those conversations were, how effective they were. And then people kept talking about the fact that what we not need is more conversations. We need more conversations. And I was kind of getting a bit more concerned about that, because the difficulty I had was that I wasn't sure that more was going to be the solution. So anyway, what I want to talk to you about today is, first of all, why high performance? Because one of the things we've done right from the beginning is talked about high performance rather than just performance per se. Now, I will say, as I say very publicly all the time, I'm not saying that we should not manage underperformance. We have to. But by focusing only on that, we lose the capacity to really improve and think about where the real change can take place in high performance. So that's why we look at that end a lot more. I want to talk about what is change and why does that matter, and why how we conceptualize change affects the way we do it. And I want to then link performance and change management conversations. And the main thing that I want to do is talk about 4 different conversational types, because what became clear to me over time wasn't that we needed more, but we need to recognize that we need different. And so in the end, if you like, the takeaway from this is slow down to hurry up. That's kind of where I want to go with this. And I think it's an important part of our world because we've got so much going on and people say, I haven't got time to do this, I haven't got time to do that. And so when I suggest that we need to have 3 conversations, they go, oh, well, no, I haven't got time for that. So, well, actually, the chances are you're doing that conversation 3 times. Why don't we do different ones, but get a better outcome? And that's kind of where we're sitting at the moment. So that's what I'm trying to talk about today. The other thing to explain is what I see performance management as being, and it's not the appraisal system, it's not a separate thing, it's what we do every day. So it's every conversation, and it's a mechanism that underpins and integrates other management practices, because it's about how do we see, how we shape the behaviors of ourselves and of others. So it's not complicated. If we want something to change, somebody has to know something that they don't know now. You can't change your behavior if nothing inside your knowledge set stays, if nothing else changes. You can only change your behavior if you either understand something in a different way or you have some knowledge that you didn't have before. So when we recognize that, then that becomes the underpinning part of both performance management and change management. And is the reason why I keep wanting to put them together. I've always found it very odd that whether, we talk about having all these conversations in performance management over here, and we have then other people talking about change management over here. And I talk to very senior people in organizations and say, so how are you putting those 2 things together? And they just look at me as if I'm a bit strange. And I go, well, you need to. Let's see how we can do this now. The reason why we focus on high performance is because it's actually quite hard to achieve. And there's a whole range of reasons for this, and I could spend a lot of time talking about all of them. But just for some examples, there's multiple perspectives. We've got lots of people with different views, and they're not necessarily managing to work together particularly well. We've got lack of clarity around expectations and what people think is going to happen and what's going to come out of things. What does high performance actually look like? And I'll come back to that in a little while. What experience we bring. So everything that we bring changes the way we see the world, and that will therefore vary in how we think things should look. Our communication styles, I mean, you know this much better than I do because of what you all do, but so different, so complex, and we think we're communicating and we're not. And the real thing is, who knows what it looks like? So one of the problems with high performance is we asked a lot of people when we were doing our research previously, so what would high performance look like for you? And they go, well, I don't want this. And it's like, yeah, that's not what I asked you. I asked you, what do you want? And they're like, oh, well, no, I definitely don't want that. So one of the biggest things is, if you don't know what high performance looks like, how can you possibly explain it to somebody else? And so that's the first conversation. What will this look like if it's working? How will I know? And that's a really important one for something like culture. We want to have a change culture. Okay, how will you know if it's working? How will you know what you've done? And I'll come back to this in a bit because it's a critical part of what we do. So we tend to talk in terms of we're going to change the culture and then. And I always say, well, that's great. You can all relax. Nothing's going to happen. Because what that implies is that we're going to somehow magically get a new culture, which will then shape the behaviors that we want, which we will in some way reward through that culture usually. And that will set the norms. And this seems to be the expectation of how this will work. But this isn't how culture changes. This is how culture changes, which is we have to identify the behaviors to begin with. Now, let me give you an example. I will get people ringing me up and saying, we want to have a learning culture. And I go, well, that's lovely. Why? And they kind of say, well, because we want people to learn. And I'm like, yeah, okay, fine. But you think that's going to solve something. So what is it that you actually want to be different, that you think the learning culture will change? Because that's what really matters here. Not the learning culture, but the behavior that you think the learning culture will either create or stop. Because if you don't identify that, you don't clarify that, you've got absolutely no chance of getting there. Once we've got to there, then we can work out how to reward that behavior, and the learning culture may be part of it. Eventually, if we reward it and we get norms, then we may get a learning culture, which will then hold this in place. And another example was actually about conversations. So I was asked by one organization to come in and to help with rewrite their performance management. And I said, okay, fine, I can do that. And I came in and I said, what do you want? This with more conversations. And they said, no, you don't. No, you don't. You think that will get you to something else. What's the thing you want? And it took me about 2 weeks to get people to stop talking about more conversations as the outcome of the changes and what they actually required, what they thought those more conversations could do. So that identification of what is the high performance end state is a really important issue here that we can then start to move around. So ask yourself, when people say we want to achieve this, is that really what they want? Or do they think that's the way to it? Because if you're looking at the solution and the intervention, you're going to look for the wrong things, you're going to evaluate the wrong things. It's going to, what you will end up with is an intervention, but you don't necessarily get what you want out of the intervention. And the other thing I just want to say quickly is just a quick word about agency as well. So what we're trying to do with all of the things to do with change, to do with coaching, whatever it is we're trying to do, we're trying to shape agentic decisions. So an agentic decision is the fact that I have the right, the capacity to make a decision about what I do. It's shaped by all the things around me. It's shaped by my work. It's shaped by my boss. It's shaped by my expectations of myself and expectations of others and my experiences. It's shaped by a whole load of different things. But at the end of the day, I make decisions about how hard I work, when I work, where I work, also how I treat my colleagues, all sorts of things. And who makes the decision is really, really important here. And the reason I've given you this cartoon, which I'm assuming you've all got a screen, but in case you haven't, it says the door is alarmed, the window is startled, and the floor is somewhat taken aback. And the reason I use this one is because obviously, clearly, that's silly. But the door is alarmed. We know what it actually means. It means there was an alarm system somewhere. But actually, this is something we do all the time. How many times do you hear the organization says, the organization thinks? Well, no, it doesn't. The people do. And my favorite story for this one, which poor Natalie's heard on several occasions now, is when I got a new job and I was going to be in charge of setting up a new program across the university. And I went and spoke to the people involved with it. And I said, right, I want to do this. And they said, oh, you can't do that. I said, oh, why can't I do that? Oh, the policy won't let you. I said, oh, that's frightening. Well, can you take me to meet the policy? They said, what do you mean? I said, well, if the policy won't let me, then I need to go and talk to it. And so they looked at me and said, well, you said it won't let me. I need to change its mind. Then I asked a slightly more sensible question. And I said, so actually, who writes the policy? And there was a lot of thinking and shuffling. And then they said, oh, I suppose you do. I said, well, that's perfect. I tell you what we'll do. I'll have a chat with myself about it, and then we'll start changing it tomorrow. But the reason that matters is because the agency was being ascribed to a policy. A policy doesn't have agency. The people who run the policy do. So when we're thinking about change, we've got to recognize who has the agency in any situation. And the reality is that there will be no change unless individuals take different agentic decisions from the ones that they are taking at the moment. So that then brings me on to the high performance characteristics. These, I'm not going to go through them all in detail, but these are the things that are generally considered to be the things that are present in organizations that are considered high performing over a period of time. Not surprisingly, they're strategic. Not so surprisingly, they're outcome focused. Not surprisingly, there's lots around learning and capability and capacity. But there's also things around the management of expectations of everybody across the organization. And there's also vertical and horizontal system alignment. Everything has to fit together. All the bits have to work. And part of that is then recognizing that when we are setting up performance, we always talk about the organizational performance and the individual performance must align. But what does that actually mean? How do we do that? And in other places, we talk about mutuality, that there has to be a shared understanding of where we're going and why we're going there. And without that, we can't get there and we won't get the decisions that we want. And again, that may sound obvious, but it's a particularly vital part of the puzzle. There's always a decision. And I think Natalie said that she was having a talk earlier on looking at Kotter, and he talks about the need to build the guiding coalition. Now, there's something very important about that phrase guiding, because in the literature, it frequently gets turned into the leading coalition and sometimes even the dominant coalition. And the point about a guiding coalition is that everybody is brought together, there is buy-in, there's a shared understanding of where things are going, and everybody moves forward. That's a very different situation from a leading coalition where the people in charge decide where they're going and try and bring people following. So if you think about change through a guiding coalition, then that means you've got to have that shared understanding and that mutuality. And that comes through a lot of these issues around high performance characteristics. Without them, you won't get that. And the bottom one, which sometimes causes a bit of discussion, which is walk the talk, is that a characteristic? It is. And the reason it is because it's this idea of consistency. If you hear one thing, so you're told this is going to be, let's take, we're going to have a learning culture, we're going to have a no blame culture, we're going to do all of these things, but you see things which are completely contrary to that, you will always go with what you see and not what you are told. Always. It's a basic fact of how we know this for many years of watching people. So the walking the talk is that authenticity. It's that everything is aligned and working together, and there's a consistency of what you see and what you hear. Okay, so those are kind of things that we're trying to achieve through our change in order to achieve high performance. And the reason why those characteristics matter is they're nearly all about people. They're all about what the people need to be doing to be engaged, to be learning, to be capable, all of those things. And I could just see that Heather, I listen, I hear, I see, I understand, role modeling and walking the talk, absolutely. And without that, it just doesn't happen. So what is change? Well, that might sound like an obvious question. Everybody knows what change is. It's to make the form, nature, content, future course, etc., something different from what it is now. And it's to become different or undergo alterations. So what matters about that? Well, that it will be specifically different at the end, but that you've got to be really clear about where you're going. Now, I agree that sometimes things have to change and be adaptive, but what is change matters because, so for example, a lot of the time we start thinking that the structure change that we're doing is our change, but structure can only ever be a tactic. We should be restructuring because we want to do something else. Going back to my identify the behavior, you didn't sit up one day and go, what we really want to do is change the structure. What you said is we want to be able to have more participative decision making or something else. That's the change. Keep focused on what it is you want to be different and where it is you're going, or you won't get there. So that's what matters about those. Something has to be there. The next thing to think about change is that we have two very, very different ways of looking at change. And I'm sure you know this, but it's important for us to think about this right now. So a constructionist world is different from a structural functionalism world. A structural functionalism world says that we're going to be very, probably quite mechanistic about this. It's about saying that the job of a change agent is to align or fit. I'm just trying to see if no, I have missed, of course. Okay. So the job of a change agent is to align, fit, or adapt organizations to interventions to an objective reality that is out there. So we know what our change is going to be. We're very clear about it, and we're going to try and sort it out. And I was given a lovely example a couple of days ago about two organizations that were brought together, two different agencies brought together in a big, big merger, because that was going to lead to this these better set of outcomes. And everybody was saying, because they do this and they do this, and it was all very organized, and change the job descriptions, organize the structure, get it all together, everything will be fine. Well, it wasn't. It wasn't fine for so many, many reasons, not least of which it was an imposed change in a culturally inappropriate setting. But the other reason it wasn't was because it wasn't two machines that could be brought together that way. It's two places full of people, all of whom were trying to do a really good job, but didn't really understand why the merger was happening. Part of that is because when we look at a constructivism view of the world, it's quite different. And what we say with that is that when we've got constructivism, change comes, as I said, because of new knowledge. So What happens as a result of the change will depend on the knowledge set of the people who are there and what they see and what they want and where they're going and all of those kind of things. So what we can see here is that a constructionist world is different from that of a structural functionalist because a change is not a discrete entity that can be described and identified. Instead, it can be seen as a series of conversations organized around a particular theme, which will shape what people know and how they react. And I've always loved this quote by Ford: it's more like experimental theatre in that the script is being written while the play is being performed. And I don't know if any of you have been to experimental theatre. I know there has been one recently actually in Melbourne. And what usually happens with them is that they have, well, there's different ways of it working. Sometimes it's people call out and make changes. The one I'm thinking of particularly is where there's several different sets and you can move from one set to the other. They're often in kind of a circle and there's usually 4 or 5 different sets and different doors going through. And you choose the play that you want to have because you say, oh, I'm really interested in what Natalie's doing. I think I'll follow Natalie. When she goes off stage, I'll go with her and see what's happening. And then you go through and you watch what Natalie's doing there, but she's talking to somebody else. And you think, oh, actually, I'm really interested in knowing what Heather's doing. So I'm going to follow Heather this time. So Natalie may stay on the stage, but you go with Heather. What that means is, of course, that everybody goes to the play will come away with completely different experiences depending on where they chose to go. So they can all say, I went to the play. They did. They went to the play on the same day, but their experience was totally different. We don't think of that happening in the same way with change in organizations, but it does. It does based on what we listened to, which bit of the meetings we heard, which of the meetings we went to, what our previous experiences, what we're actually listening for. So each of us comes away with a different perspective. And so what we're realizing, if we think of it that way, is that it becomes a series of conversations which will shape the knowledge that people have, and that will then create the buy-in or not, the movement or not, as they move forward. And going back to my merger, that was because although they were merging 2 organizations, inevitably the conversations didn't get merged. They were running really in parallel inside the same shell for a very long time, and it turned out that they never really came together, and all the savings and the changes that people wanted that they thought could be done through a structural change needed far more support, which simply wasn't happening. So then this is, why do I link change to conversations? Well, because if we think of as an organization as a network of conversations creating different reality, then that's what we're now having to actually manage, is the wrong word. Natalie knows that I love the work by somebody called Donella Meadows, and she talks about systems, and she always says you can't control a system, you have to dance with it. You have to lead it and guide it, and that's really what we're doing when we start to think of organizations as a network of conversations. The performance conversations, i.e. the conversations we have every day with people about what they should be doing, coaching conversations, managing conversations, any conversation which is trying to change the performance of somebody in some way, can support the development of new realities which are about change. So if you really want change, then you've got to be having the consistency. So going back to walking the talk, that means every single conversation that is around performance has to fit with what they're talking about in the change space. Otherwise, there's this disconnect all the time. And I would argue that failing to see this is one of the reasons. It's not the only reason, but it's definitely one of the reasons why we get organizational change failure. And we do, it's very common. So then we think about, well, what do conversations actually need? And that might sound really obvious, but actually what they need is somebody who is listening and absorbing things from somebody else. And again, in your roles, you know that better than most people. But it's not as straightforward as that, as we know. And so one of the issues we're trying to do is that a lot of the time we think we're having the same conversation and we're not. Now, I don't want to encourage you to be badly behaved in meetings, because far from me to encourage bad behavior. But when I'm bored at a meeting that I'm not chairing, one of the things I like to sometimes do is say, well, we're all talking about whatever it might be. And at the moment, it's frequently accountability and transparency. And I said, well, that's great. Could we all write down what those words mean to us and what will be different when they're working? And everybody goes, oh, for goodness sake. I go, no, humor me. Let's just give it a go. And we all write them, say there's 6 people in the room, and they write it down. And that's when they realize that they've all got a completely different understanding, often of the word, and definitely of what it will look like if it's working. Motivation is another one. Oh, we want to motivate people. Well, that's great. What do you mean by that? Do you mean that they're going to want to work harder? Do you want to mean that they're going to be happier? Do you want to mean that they're going to have better quality control? What will be different if they're motivated? Because a lot of them may be much happier, but working harder and being happier don't necessarily go together. What do you really mean? And so this is what we're trying to think about when we're looking at this issue of shared understanding, is that it's obvious if somebody's speaking French and somebody's speaking German that there may be no understanding. But often people are using the same words, having the same conversation, and yet it becomes absolutely clear that there is no shared understanding of what's going on at all. But they think there is because they all know the words. So what we're needing to do is create that shared understanding. The reason why I show this picture is because it doesn't have to be very big to start with, just enough to start to shift the mental model. Because the other thing that why this matters about understanding is if there is nothing inside the mental model to connect with, nothing will come in. Once it's inside, then you've got a chance of moving it and more things can come in. But again, back to language, why do we need Google Translate? It enables us to start the conversation. It may not be completely right, but it gives enough for people to laugh at the problems and start to communicate. So what is it that's going to create that blue area is what we're thinking about when we're starting about managing conversations for change. And I think for me in the last year when I've been thinking about, because I'm the head of school as well, so I have had a dual role. I talk about this as a theorist, but sometimes I have to sit myself down and say, well, if you were doing this yourself, what would you be doing now? What would you be telling yourself? And one of the things was, okay, I'm communicating a lot with my team. I'm talking to them. I've made time to talk to them all the time. And every week I speak to everybody, which was quite a big commitment, but that I took to do. But then it was, what am I going to talk about? Because just turning up is fine. What do I need to do? What do I need to make sure is happening? Does everybody understand what is, when I'm asking them, are you okay? What does that actually mean? That means, does your equipment work? Yes. Does that? Yes, it means that. It means, do you know what you need to do work-wise? Yes, it means that. But it also means, are you okay? You're at home, you're with the family. Are things all right? Do you feel that you can tell me? So what does that mean? What does that question mean that I'm trying to think about? So this is all about how do we change a conversation? What do we want to be different, and what might it look like if it works? They're my two favorite questions that I use all the time when I'm starting to think about these things. That's where I go with it. It's this one. So how do we change conversations? Well, we do it through a range of recognizing that we need to have different types of conversations in a particular order, and that we usually start at number 3 and we have to start at number 1. So the first type of conversation is, as it says here, an initiative conversation, which starts, changes, acts as a new input or stimuli, explains why, triggering ideas and suggesting the need for alternatives. Doesn't suggest what the alternatives are, it suggests the need for alternatives. So the point of the initiative conversation is literally, if we go back, it's to create something in here that says we both agree that we need to do something different. We're not even beginning to work out what, we just know that it needs to be something. And it can be a really straightforward thing. So how many times have you said to somebody, I need to just catch up with you quickly? Well, that's great, but you haven't told them why. And one of the tricks that we've been talking to people about is saying, I really need to talk to you. And this is actually really good about managing up as well as across and down. I really need to talk to you about X because we need to sort out Y. You don't do anything else. And if they start to talk to you, say, no, I don't want to talk about it now, but I'm going to put it in your diary. And when that's what it'll be about. It's about, we need to talk about X because we need to achieve Y. Why does that matter? Well, because now the neural pathways are connected to that concept, and suddenly they'll hear things around them that they've not heard before. If any of you have ever bought a new car, when you're looking for a new car, you think, oh, I've chosen something quite different and it's really good. And I bought a bright blue car and I'd not seen any that way. And once I decided to buy it, and once I decided, it's good, everybody got one, because now it's in my mental model to look for that car. And it turns out, yeah, I was not the first by a very long chalk. But because that wasn't what I was looking for conceptually before, I didn't see it. So there's this thing that and you'll know it yourself, that you've had a conversation, you've heard something, and suddenly it turns up everywhere. Everybody's talking about this thing that you'd never heard about until the week before. So that's one of the reasons why you want an initiative conversation, is because you want them to now realize it's not just you. The whole context is talking about this. And this is then why we need to be thinking about these things. It's the reason why the other one, when we talk about well-being, one of the things that worries me about talking about well-being at the moment is that people go straight to mental health. And I'm not saying that mental health is not a very important thing, but it's not the only part of well-being. So when I start to talk about well-being, I will say, I really need to have a talk to you about X. And I will say, because we need to think about the role of purpose in well-being, for example, because I don't want them to immediately go to mental health. I want them to think about well-being more broadly. So think about what it is that you want to create as the concept and where you're going, and then you stop, because all you want is to make sure that there is an agreement that you need to have a conversation about this thing. The next conversation is an understanding conversation. And that's when you then come together to actually talk about it. Now, the other reason why it matters that you don't do too much of the initiative conversation is that frequently one person is not yet ready for the conversation, because in your head, if you're starting it, you, without meaning to, have had that conversation for some time. You've been thinking about it, it's been going around in your head. We think of a conversation as two-way, and it is, but the preparation for the conversation isn't necessarily. And you think you know where you're going. My favorite example of this is actually a colleague of mine, Karen, who once, when I was doing this talk once when she was there, she came up to me afterwards, she said, oh, that explains the issue with Oscar. And Oscar's her 25-year-old son. And he's a sculptor, and he sculpts very large, very complex mechanical things. And he was having trouble finding space to work, find an effective studio. And she was planning to move house. So she decided that it'd be a really good idea. She'd buy a bigger house that had a space for a studio. He could have an apartment. It'd be fantastic. So she goes up to Oscar and she says, Oscar, I've been thinking about it. You know, I'm going to buy a new house. Why? Well, what we can do is you can have an apartment and have a studio, and it'll be great. And of course, what he hears is, I'm 26 years old and my mother thinks I should move home. He was nowhere ready on that. He had no idea what was going on. And so if she'd pushed that, which we often do because we want to have the conversation and get on with it, you've got somebody who's not prepared. And the other thing you've got to remember is you've got people like me who we think by talking, drives other people crazy, right? If I was in a room with you all, I'd say, put up your hand if you're the one who has to talk things through. And then I'd say to the other people, put up your hands if you're the sort of person who needs to think, read, reflect. And how often do you wish people like me would just shut up long enough for me to think, right? So the problem is, if we're those two types of people and I want to have the conversation, you're like, I'm not ready. So the whole point of an initiative conversation is it's just shaping it so that then both people can be ready when they come back next time. And when you come back next time, then you can have the understanding conversation. Right, are we really clear what it is we want to achieve, why we want to achieve it? That's the important bit. Why do we need to do it? What would it look like if it's working? Then go away and have another think. And sometimes you have to have 2 or 3 understanding conversations. I learned this really clearly when I was trying to get a website changed a few years ago. I thought I had been really clear. Think about this in terms of your user. This is not about what you want to tell people. This is about what they're going to find. Please, can you make sure that you really are user-centered? You can throw away everything that's here. You can do it a different way. And 3 times it came back looking almost identical to the way it did now. And I had to each time go, stop fixing what we have. I need you to think about what it should look like and why. And in fact, in the end, I said, would you please not come back with pictures of screens? I'm not interested in pictures of screens. I want to know the concept. And it was about giving permission and giving permission and giving permission until finally we had a shared understanding of what we were actually doing. And then we could actually do the performance conversation, which is generating action and clarifying what we different in the final version. The difficulty is we are trained to get on with stuff. And so we mostly start at number 3. And we go in and we go, right, we want to do this, and we need an action plan, and we need to do this, and we need to do that. And I remember with one team, they said, right, so we've got to get the risk assessment done. I said, we can't do the risk assessment. We don't know what we're going to do yet. Oh, yes, because, when we do any of these projects, the risk assessment's got to be completed by the end of week 2. And I said, well, it can't be. We don't know what we're going to do yet. Well, and there was, well, we need to decide this, and we need to decide this. And I found it quite fascinating. And I had to keep pushing back and saying, you can't do a risk assessment exercise because we don't know what we're doing. But there was all of this project planning and all of these things which were in place. And I said, but none of this makes any sense. And so you can see that the style of this works for anything that you're doing. And then the last one is a closure conversation, because everything does need to be stopped at some point. And so you're closing it. Maybe you're closing this bit and starting a new conversation. It may be that you agree that you don't need to talk about it again, whatever it might be. And what we do when we do this in organizations is we usually I do the theoretical part, and then we ask people to go away and choose a conversation, and there's various tools that we use to enable them to do that, and then come back and tell us how it worked. And the thing that they talk about is all the time how they really were thinking, oh, I haven't got time for this, I haven't got time for this. But they've committed to it, so they have a go at one, and they think about it. And one of my favorite examples was somebody who was having terrible trouble getting her team to prioritize their work. And she said, I've given them all these tools and it's just not working, and I don't know where we're going. And I said, well, okay, fine. And I said, so what are you planning to do with your conversation? And she said, well, I'm going to start with the initiative of, we need to do this. I said, I think you need to start and sit down with them and say, we need to do this, not why or how, but just, are we all in agreement that the current system is not working? I said, because if you can get an agreement that the current system is not working, then in their heads, they're all prepared now for a conversation about how it will work. And I said, you're probably going to have to do 2 or 3 understanding conversations. So anyway, she said, off she went. And I wasn't sure how it was going to go. And she came back 2 weeks later and she went, okay, I have a new team. And I said, why? What happened? She said, well, I did what you said. And I said to them at our morning stand-up, I want us to talk about how we're prioritizing work. Are we all in agreement it's not working right now? And they all said, oh, yeah, definitely. She said, and then I had one, what would it look like if it was working? And then, of course, she said that they've fixed it for me. They've solved it, and now it's working really well. I said, yeah, you see, that's the really big difference. They knew how to do it, but there was no space for them to do it and no space for them to have a shared view of what it should look like. And the final version they chose wasn't what any of them had come up with at the beginning, because it was all about having conversations about what it needed to do. And she said she realized that was what they never did. They kept talking about how to do it, but at no point had they really stopped and worked out. They knew they had to prioritize, and they were talking about doing it, but they hadn't really thought about why. Why did they need to do it? How was it affecting each other when they weren't doing it well? So why does any of this matter? Well, because change needs integrated alignment of ideas. And to get that, we need to make sure that we've got that shared understanding and that recognition that it's going to start to move. You can't get what you can't explain. So there's been some picking up on that in the chat. If you can't tell somebody what it is, and you can't share with them how you want it to look, there's no way they're actually going to be able to do it. And also, if you can't explain it, then there's no chance that anybody, really, why should anybody able to do it? And one of the examples I've got for this one was we had somebody, I was doing the development, and I said, how many times have you had the same conversation more than twice? And one of them decided that, one of my team, we've had this conversation, it's probably the 4th time now, and she knows she needs to change and she hasn't changed. And I said, well, I trust you're never going to have that conversation again. He said, well, actually, I'm going to talk to her about it again tomorrow. I said, well, don't. Please don't do that. It's a waste of your time and a waste of her time, and it's just annoying. What is the conversation and why is it not working? And so he said, well, she knows she has to change. I said, okay, because she's not doing a good job. I said, okay, well, back to my previous question. What does high performance look like for her? And he started telling me all the things he didn't want. I said, stop it. I'm not interested in any of that. Tell me what it looks like if it's working. If she's a high performing employee, how will you know? What will she be doing And he kept going back to what she couldn't do. And I said, you can't tell me, can you? He said, no. I said, well, how could she possibly find out then? So I pushed him and pushed him and pushed him. And eventually, he said, we worked out that there were 2 behaviors that were quite complex things that she needed to be able to do that nobody had ever taught her how to do. She needed to be able to synthesize literature, which isn't a skill that many people have. And then she needed to be able to integrate that literature into a whole series of other things that she was doing. And again, she had no way of knowing how to do that because nobody had ever shown her how to do it. And so I said, so right, so now you can go back to her and talk to her about the initiative conversation will be about, clearly there's something that we're asking you to do that you don't know how to do, and you can start to get her to think about what that is. And then you can come up with a shared understanding of what are the skills that you think she really needs that she hasn't got. And then you can work out a performance plan of how she's going to achieve those skills. And then when she's got them, that'll be the closure. And then you can start making sure that they're being integrated into work. I said, but it's up to you, but I would do that rather than go and annoy both of you with the same conversation all over again. And he was very, very sheepish, to be fine. Yeah, so how old is this? So the Heather Jane, yeah. How old is it? Yeah. Can exactly have the same conversation over and over again. And I can't quite remember the quote, but I heard something the other day. So just because it's historical doesn't make it interesting. That's what you go to museums for. This is not for where you work. So yes, you can't get what you can't explain. Now, you may need to work together to get to the explanation, but you've got to get to there. Conversation readiness needs preparation. Now, that as coaches, that's not something I need to talk to you about. But for many people who are being coached, the fact that they need to prepare different types of conversations and change, they are trained to do performance, they're trained to get things done. That's the hard bit. And that's what I meant by slowing down to speed up, coaching them to not try and fix things, but to try to actually understand what needs to be fixed and getting people on the side with that first. That's actually quite hard to do. And that's the slowing down may speed things up. So, and I found as we went through COVID, there was a lot of things that people had to react to really quickly and do very fast. But we could do them faster because there was a shared understanding of what we were doing. And that's why you should never wait, they never waste a good crisis. And I think when we're talking about that kind of thing, the mental model is much more pliable. So, if you think about the mental model, the sum things of all the things of the world right now, it's much more pliable when there's a crisis, because we all know that things have got to change. The hardest is when we then start to work out what to do. It's why I really don't like the words new normal. There's a whole bunch of stuff I don't like about it. But one of them is that, it's assuming that we're going to settle down and put everything back. And I've just had a question. Can you talk about conversations across teams? You can do exactly the same with this. So yes, I can talk about it. So does this work with many groups who expect to work together with different purposes? Yes. And in fact, I would say it's even more critical. So when you've got different purposes, the question is, there must be something that is a shared purpose, which is the reason you've got to come together. So you've got to start with, what is the shared purpose that each of us have to contribute to? So if you've all got different purposes, if you come into the room, everybody's fighting for their bit, unless there's an overarching understanding. So the conversation, if we go through the initiative one, is, why is it we need to work together as a group? There's this touching faith that collaboration is good. Well, it is, but only if we can do it well. And we're actually doing quite a lot about the concept of collaboration as an intergroup or interorganizational capability that we have to learn how to do. And if you think about it in terms of coaching, it's about learning which are the conversations that you need. And so the initiative is not, as it often is getting people together and everybody taking a bit of the puzzle and doing a bit and going off. But actually stopping and saying, right, why is it we are in this room working together? What will it look like? What is our purpose? Where are we going? And trying to come up with a shared view of that. And without that, it won't work. The interesting thing about shared purpose is it is much more effective than culture. So when people say, oh, we need to have, a group, we need to have everybody getting on, no, you don't need any of that. What you need is everybody going the same direction. So I would actually say that this is exactly the same thing. You go through this, and it's hard. So you've got to have really good facilitators who are going to stop the default behavior will be to get in and out as soon as possible, each person fight for their own purpose, and everybody go away doing their bit. So you've got some strong facilitation that's required at the beginning, group coaching, to be able to get people to agree to what it is that their purpose is, where they're going, what that will look like, and then how they're going to do it at a later date. And the first conversation is usually an agreement about how we're going to work, not what are we going to do. So I don't know if that helps, Gino, but that's pretty much the way I would start thinking about this. And I'm sure there'll be some other comments from your colleagues as well. And shared mental models need work, right? They don't happen overnight. And we don't need everything to be the same, but there needs to be enough. That comes back to the point, Gino. There has to be a shared mental model across the group of what it is we're doing. And an awful lot of the time there isn't. So I'm going to stop. I'm aware of the time, so I'm going to stop and take in more questions, comments, whatever it might be. So over to you, Natalie.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Deborah. You said not to take. You didn't think I'd need to take notes, but actually I did. There's plenty of additional notes I've taken, even though I have heard the presentation before. And I think the one thing that stood out for me this time was that do we agree that the system's not working? So, you know, getting that shared agreement and just focusing on that, I think, as that initial conversation is so important. And I've written down all the other questions. You know, what is it they really want? And it's not just they say that they want coaching, but what is it that they actually want? So I think from a coach's point of view, it's like, oh, they want coaching, great. But what is it that they want? What is it that they want coaching to actually do, or what do they want to be different? So thank you for that really great reminder.
Well, that is really important, because we have this with particularly with our mid-career researchers who keep saying, I want mentoring. Well, yeah, okay. Why do you want mentoring? I mean, I can see that you think it's sparkly, but what is it? What will be different? Why do you need mentoring? And frequently, actually, they need coaching, not mentoring. So that's the first problem. But also, frequently, what they need is something completely different. But so it is the shorthand is, we want mentoring means we need help, but we're not quite sure what. It's like when people say they want more communication, you get this every single staff survey, we want more communication. And somebody thinks that means it's a newsletter. No, really, please don't do that to them. What they mean is there's things I don't understand and I want to understand them more, and I want communication, but I don't just want you to tell me things. I need to understand things, but I can't say that. I have an industrial relations background from a very long time ago. And we always used to talk about strikes. People strike for money, not because they necessarily want more money, but you can explain that. It's much harder to say, I'm striking because nobody's been very nice to me. It's hard to stand up in front of television and go, well, they've not been very kind, but I can explain it. So it's always about, this is what's being said, but it's, oh, now that's really interesting. So Heather Jane has just said, takes you back to Senger's work in learning organizations. Okay, so the reason why it's making me laugh is I did a whole PhD on why that wasn't a very good book. And it wasn't that I didn't agree with the ideas in it, but the problem for me was it didn't explain how to do it. So all those things around systems. So this is why Natalie and I laugh slightly, is because that's why I now use Delano Meadows' work, because what that does is help us actually analyze systems and start to think it through. But what it does do, because the other thing is shared mental models are really important. Vision is just a shared mental model. It's just a very specific one. But I absolutely agree that shared mental models matter. But there wasn't enough in there for me as to how that happens. So yes, it's just really interesting to see that, because that's, to be honest, all of this comes back from studying that many years ago. So yes, that's exactly, it's how I got to here, just on a slightly odd route. So thank you. Yeah. Yes, the field book it does help, and his recent stuff on leadership I think is useful, and it does pick up this issue of the guide, and it's why the guiding versus the leading coalition is really important, because a guiding coalition will create shared mental models. A leading coalition doesn't necessarily do that, and that's the fundamental difference between the two in my world anyway. Okay, sorry Nat. I interject.
Oh, no, that's great. I love it. Love it. I've got another question for you. It's. I don't think it's off topic because it's been what we've been talking about today as well. But I'm interested, Deborah. What do you think about those models like Cotter and Tuckman, and like they've been around for years? I feel like they're still relevant, and we can still keep them alive and relevant. But I'm interested just from a you know, straw poll here, what you think about that as well.
I think the thing about any model is they are only as useful as the application context that they are in. So something like Cotter is good with the 8 steps of change if you recognize that what that really should be is there are 8 things that we need to think about. They sort of go in this order. And really what this means is there's no point in going through with this unless we've got everybody on side and we're moving forward.
Mm.
The difficulty becomes that people project plan it. And they take the 8 stages and they chunk it up, and it becomes a functional structuralist view of how to do it. And Cotter, in particular, can get taken that way. I mean, so the answer is all of them are useful if they're applied in a helpful way. So Lewin, for example, with unfreeze, change, refreeze, was terribly unpopular because it was all just too static, and that's only because people hadn't read it carefully. Really, when you think about it a different way, which is we've got to get, there's no point in having a change if there's no change readiness. So unfreezing is about getting change readiness. Then we make the change, and then we support the implementation of that change until it becomes habit. So if we think about it that way, then it makes perfect sense. But we have to think about it in the way that we're doing it. So I think the answer is, and Tuckman's the same, forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning. Yeah, it's a really useful thing. And the reason I think it's really useful is because it says, well, actually, you can't just put people in a room and expect it to be magically okay. You have to give people time to develop the norms, make it through, keeping it going, because you've got to think through where you're going with these things. So we need models. We need models and heuristics because we need to be able to organize our thinking. The only problem is, and this comes back to what Heather's just said here, models need critical thinking for the application, because you've got to use the model to come up with something clever, not have the model guide you, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So yeah. I think every model has a space. And going back to Zengo, there's a lot to be said for thinking about the different areas. But then it's about going, yes, but actually there wasn't enough. So what's new? How do we build it? How do we take it forward? But it's about organizing your thinking and thinking it through.
Yes, and you've thank you for clarifying that, and I'm fascinated to hear your opinion as always. And there's a couple of people in the chat have actually said that's a really great clarification that you've actually made there. So thank you. You've also troubled me because now I'm thinking about Lewin's model of freeze, unfreeze, and how that applies to coaching, and how as coaches we enable that process in our clients, and if they're not prepared to do that, what happens to the outcomes that they want. So thanks. I probably won't be able to sleep tonight.
Well, if you go back to Lewin, it becomes about enablers and barriers. And I think the thing about that is that I tend to see the world, well, as you know, I see the world in pictures. And I think it's often useful with Lewin to think about the whole world as a seesaw. And one of the exercises that you can do with Lewin that I'm sure many of you will have done is you go through all the barriers and the enablers, and you then label them for which you think is stronger and weakest, and you put them onto a sheet, and you end up with what looks like, the seesaw model of where your a visual of your change. And the beauty of that is something you can do with a team, and you can really get them to think it through, and they end up with a picture on the wall of this is the current situation. And then you start to say, well, what do we need to change? Now, the instinctive reaction is everybody goes to the ones at the end to try and move the big ones. And actually you go, no, they are really immovable, right? Those are the big problems. Now, this is about gravity. How much of these do you need to move? So if you've got some things which are currently an enabler, but not a very strong enabler, can you make it stronger? If you've got something that's a barrier, but it's not a big barrier and it could be made an enabler, how do you do that? Because eventually gravity will take over, and the stuff at the end will either move or fall off. And the example I would give on that one is, we were doing some work on performance management readiness. Okay. So I think we think about this in terms of, we're about to put in a new performance management system, and we assume that everybody's got the same view of things, and so we have one set of messaging. But we did it and we realized we're 4 different viewpoints. One was never going to come on board, one was already there, and then the others could be moved in a way. And it's not low-hanging fruit necessarily, Mike, because it may be actually having to move things, but it's the things that are movable. But the problem with low-hanging fruit is it always implies something a bit quick fix, and these aren't necessarily quick fixes, but they're the things that have the most capacity to be changed. So it could be that, but just be careful about thinking about it that way. What it is, it's about saying these are the things that could be done more easily. And so what we did with the performance management one was about saying, right, if you get these 2 groups on side as well, then actually that's enough. The others will either come in or frankly they will go, and that might be the way thinking of. So yes, yes, there we go.
A great visual also, as you mentioned, to think about when we're coaching as well. So what
it's a fabulous thing for if you're doing groups in particular. It's a fabulous way of getting a really clear picture. And again, it's the conversation. So you can then go back to your coaching conversations. So you then can you can ask questions about, well, why is that there? How are we going there? All of those ideas. And then eventually you can start to say, so change readiness. I mean, and if if your seesaw is really, really firmly in the it's not moving, you're not ready to change. It's not hard. So this is why the other thing why it's useful with the Lewin model is to say, okay, what we've now understood is if we start now, we aren't going anywhere. So this is about readiness. Let's not even try now. We've got a whole bunch of work to do before we even try to do anything. And let's get that moving, because the problem with the change word, as we know, is that people's ears get a bit blocked.
True.
So what are the things we can do before we really start trying to make changes? Because, of course, if it starts to move anyway, then it will start to shift. And this comes back to systems, because, of course, each of those interventions will start to move the system anyway.
Yeah.
But that's a whole different problem.
It is. There's lots of webinars now. Heather Jane's gone, oh, let's do a webinar on Lewin. Definitely. We can also
I would love to see that, because I think poor old Lewin got a hard time. Burns brought him back in fashion, actually. In about 2012, Burns brought him back in fashion. And there's lots of work by people like Amanakis and people looking at change readiness.
Yes.
But I think we don't spend enough time sometimes doing some baseline thinking about what are people's attitudes and where are people's mental models at. And we spend a lot of time selling the change without recognizing sometimes it's not that they're against the change. I mean, the one we did with the performance management, 3 groups were quite happy. One was just like, oh, so does the forms. One was, there's nothing wrong with this, but it's not our biggest problem, so how to fix that. And then the other one was, well, that's fine, but my manager can't do that, you know that, don't you? So okay, we'll make sure that your manager can do that, and then we'll be okay. Okay.
Well, it's all I can say. We are at the top of the hour now, and Deborah, on behalf of everyone, I just want to thank you so much. The enormous amount that you share with us. We're quiet because we've got to process all of this now, and I'm just so grateful for your for coming on the line, for sharing all of your thoughts. There's a lot of gratitude coming through the chat box now as well. So once again, it's been a pleasure to have you back. Thank you on behalf of Open Door, Synergy Global, and everyone here from International, that's hooked in from International Coach Week. It's just been what we needed today, I think, to keep us thinking about these things. So.
Well, thank you. And Mike says you should have me back next year, and that's very kind, but I will probably try and write something new. We should probably frighten people with system traps at some point.
We need to do systems traps. Oh, that would be exciting. Yeah. And how that then applies to coaching. That's yes.
because it's about, we're stuck. How do we unstuck? How do we unstuck?
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, I'll go away now.
Fantastic. Well, thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you.
It's and thank you for expressing the gratitude there to Deborah as well. It's such a privilege, to listen and to learn from you. So what I'll do now is I'll stop the recording.